Well, good morning. I see lots of amazing Christmas sweaters or holiday sweaters out there. I see one lighting up. My 3-year-old thought this was the best thing he had ever seen this morning. We had some personal space conversations too. So. Still working on that. All right. Well, before we begin talking about allocations and overage and having you think about all that fun stuff, we want to have you do a little conversation at your table to reflect on what you think the competing objectives might be when it comes to allocation and overage and all of the things that we are trying to balance as a part of that. So we know we're on limited time. We don't want to use more than we've been allotted, but maybe take like about 30 seconds and at your table talk about what you think the competing objectives are that have to be balanced when we're talking about giving and taking allocations and the overage process. Go ahead. All right. Whoa, that was loud. I've been working on projecting, but not like that. Okay, so my ELF colleague, Dr. Parks, is circulating among you, and let's have 2 or 3 groups share out some of the things that come to mind when you think about competing objectives in this process. ELF Parks?
Looking for a volunteer, but may designate a volunteer. Leaning towards designating.
I got nothing.
Sorry, what was the question again?
Well, how about you just tell us what you talked about at your table?
We talked about some of them were the union, WA jumps in probably a little bit with their standards. The money, of course, taking from one, pulling to another. We, as principals, hate the fact that the decisions happen after we have kids and classes and they're all set up and now we're pulling one or we're getting one, and that really creates an upheaval for all of us.
Thank you, Mr. Birdie. Any other thoughts on those competing decisions that we have to make? All right, so recognizing that when we're actually talking about real dollars, when we're talking about allocations, that's a huge one. And yes, the needs of schools is also a huge need that we have to fulfill during that process.
You touched on all of our content, so you can come on up and good job. Good job.
You can have my snowman.
So, as Kristen said earlier, we are so grateful for the work that our legislature and the governor did during the last session to secure more funding for public education. But the reality is that although the right conversations are happening and we're headed in a good direction, we're still in a situation where there is not a lot of wiggle room in our budget, right? And so you touched on that, Jim. Obviously, budget is a significant consideration, and making sure that we balance those competing objectives as a part of this process is a significant factor. It's student enrollment dependent, and there's not a lot of wiggle room beyond that. Knowing the impact that the overage process has on students, staff, and families, that's also a significant consideration. And so as we're going to share throughout this presentation, these are all of the factors that we were trying to take into consideration as we made adjustments during the last summer cycle and as we look to make additional adjustments moving forward. A theme that you'll see emerge is that we're trying to balance 3 goals, 3 primary goals. We know there are some other things to consider as well, but the 3 kind of driving forces here are, first, to be responsive to schools in the lead up to the school year. We know that you are in touch with your enrollment and your students and your families, and so how can we make adjustments while also balancing our kind of second and third goals, which are, excuse me, which are done, within the guardrails of the budget, and then with the goal of minimizing overage activity, because we know that we are bound by the contract as well. So our goal today is to share with you the work that we did last summer. We had a unique opportunity to really look at this process through a very critical eye with a new set of variables, because we had 3 new schools opening, we had 20-something sixth grades changing buildings, and so it was a really great opportunity to reevaluate the process and figure out what changes we could make. We want to share those changes with you today, and then during the level time a little bit later on, we want to get more feedback and continue that cycle of improvement to figure out how we can continue to make this process more workable for everyone, knowing that we've got some competing objectives that we are faced with in the immediate future. So I'm going to turn it over.
I'd like to build on what Emily said. As I've worked in schools and worked as an area superintendent, the allocations process was always very confusing to me, because sometimes the math wasn't the math, and as I became an area superintendent, I thought for sure I would understand exactly how it worked and be able to explain to my principals, this is why. But I can tell you, this is the first time, as Kristen talked about, this is all of our responsibility. We are a team. This summer was the first time where we ever had the opportunity to sit and talk with business, talk with human resources, and try to make some decisions to support our schools without even students being in seats yet. And so while we go through this, I don't think you're going to be able to point at a very clear, well-articulated system and process. We are, as Emily said, starting to ask ourselves, what is the best way to support our schools, and at the same time live within our means, because allocations are real dollars that we're spending. So,
good morning, everybody. I'm filling in for Jeff Bozzo. He's our assistant budget director. He's over position control. He wasn't able to make it today, so I'll try to do my best here. What I wanted to do is kind of walk you through our existing process right now. And it normally starts in November when we do an enrollment projection. We haven't quite got there yet, and we're in December, but most of you probably know Randy Baxley. He's our district's demographer. And to give you some history here, years ago, this used to be pretty stable, projecting enrollment from one year to the next, from school to school and grade by grade. It was pretty stable. Since the recession and the housing crisis, things have got a little out of whack, and it's become really volatile. This year we finally had a little uptick in enrollment, but the prior 2 years we actually had declining enrollment. And what that does to the budget is we're trying to match up the enrollment we put in the budget to the enrollment we're using for allocations. Those two have to be in line. And when we're expecting students here and providing teachers for those students, and the enrollment comes here, well, we've got dollars built into the budget that we intended to spend, but we don't have the money to pay for it. And hopefully, when we get to that point, we could overage or save some of the teachers, because if we didn't have the enrollment, we probably wouldn't need the teachers. And sometimes they're not filled or they're vacant, and we can make up for that. But the bottom line is the dollars we get at 100% only pay for about 50% teachers. So we've built a bunch of money into the budget that isn't going to show up, even if we were able to reduce those teacher numbers. And when we've had declining enrollment for several years and really volatile enrollment, it's really tough to project and build enrollment growth into the budget. So for the last few years, we've basically tried to say we're going to do flat enrollment, but even so, we actually had declining and lost some dollars. This last year, this current year, we finally did have a little uptick in enrollment, which was nice to see. We lose a lot of kids to charter schools. Charters are growing faster than our growth, well, which was only this year. But even though we do get a little uptick in enrollment, we just did our augmented budget, and we made like $79,000 more versus our budget, even though the enrollment part of that would have been about $400,000. We lost over $300,000 of that because we have to pay charter schools. They get a portion of our revenues. So their enrollment goes up, they get a portion of that. So even though we had a little uptick in enrollment, it's not like it added millions of dollars to our budget. So that's why we're really concerned from a budget perspective about how we do this. And we really want to tie the allocations process, that enrollment projection, to the enrollment we're using in the budget. And the enrollment projection is, like I say, Randy's been doing it a long time. There's a lot to that. A lot of data goes into that, and he tries to do his best. But probably the biggest, hardest part about that is projecting kindergarten enrollment, because nobody knows how many kids are going to get there. Other schools, grades kind of roll up to the next grade, things like that. Opening new schools always has an impact, which we haven't done that either for quite some time. We hadn't opened new schools in a while. So now you've got rezoning. Kids that used to go to this school are going to this school. And he tries to factor all that stuff in his enrollment projections also. So that's a big piece of this, and it's just a little dot on this chart, but it's really significant. From there, once the preliminary enrollment is established, we'll share that with you guys. It's important for you to know what we're expecting at your school. And obviously, you have a great feel for your schools, a great feel for your communities, and you can see the activity that's going on. So you get a chance to vet that enrollment and send those to your area superintendent, and Randy Baxley will typically provide a response, and we have to work all that out. But once again, this is a thing we're trying to, we're trying to look at this comprehensively on a district-wide basis, not on an individual school basis. Because once again, we're saying our enrollment's going to be here. If every school thinks, oh, I got extra kids, well, we're not changing this number here until we see the whites in their eyes or the butts in the seats, because this is really hard. I mean, we're projecting a number, and it's pretty far in advance. It might not seem that far, but when we're trying to project right now in December for next year, that's 10, 11 months in advance. And a lot of things can change. But you may be growing, you may be able to substantiate that, but in our minds, it's like, well, those kids got to be coming from somewhere. And it's really tough at this early stage. The further we are out in advance of getting to the actual event, it's really hard to project. But anyway, we have a process where you can vet those numbers, and we'll look at those and try to adjust for those if they're verified. So those adjustments are made. We update our staffing guidelines accordingly for that, and ultimately we send out staff status reports to all the schools. Those staff status reports don't just include the teachers, they include all your staffing. You have a lot of fixed allocations in the office, things like that, librarians, counselors, custodians, all that stuff, secretaries. But the enrollments can also affect some other positions. It may trigger a dean, an AP, a clerk, things like that. So that's another reason why these are really important at this point in time. Once those staff status reports go out, you guys kind of get the feel for your own employees and your teachers. Some people are retiring, some people want to transfer, some are going to leave for other purposes. So we start our spring transfer and overage process. And Emily's the expert on that one. But I don't know if anybody has any questions at this point in time about just the way it's set up. So, like I said, this covers a long period of time. Even, we're in April, May, and you've got these staff status reports. A lot of stuff can happen over the summer, and you guys are pretty good at talking to your area superintendents about what you're feeling at your schools, what's going on, things like that. And once again, we have these main goals. You know, we want to provide you support. We still want to live within our budget, and we want to minimize this fall overage process because that's very impactful to students and teachers. So once again, we're trying to say we need to look at this comprehensively. We can't just go school by school. And remember, we're still a few months out before school's even starting. And we're trying to get to a point where we've got a lot of kids enrolled, but we don't have them registered. So you're probably seeing a push from the area soups to say, and it's not like you guys don't make effort to try to get all the parents to register their kids, and I know sometimes it's difficult for them to do that, but that's what we're trying to say. The earlier you can get your kids registered, the more valid these numbers become. Because when we see somebody saying, oh, we're going to have all this growth, we're going to Infinite Campus. And we're going, okay, you've got this many kids enrolled, but you got 30% of them registered. It's really hard to make a decision about your school when only 30% of the kids have actually registered at this point in time. So we've been trying to look at those numbers to say, okay, some of you guys could be 90% registered, and it's like, these kids are coming. I mean, they're ready. And there's a lot of stuff that has to happen in the system with Infinite Campus. Another school has to take them out before you can put them in and things like that, and that takes a little bit of time also. But we're trying to use as much data and information as we can to make these decisions during the summer. And once again, let's try to stay within these really three mutual goals. And if we do hand out or give out more allocations, at this point in time, we still don't know the big picture. We still don't know what's going to happen on count day. So normally it will be a long-term sub, something like that, not a teacher allocation. If we have to do some overages, it may give a placeholder for a teacher to move from one school into this long-term sub area, and it minimizes reduction of staff and things like that. So I talked a little bit about trying to use Infinite Campus, and Troy wanted to expand on that just a little bit.
So thank you, Mike. As we worked this summer, and we had reason because we had new schools opening, that there was a need at several of the schools that were opening that even though we couldn't count the kids, we did have registration in IC suggesting that we needed to make decisions because at the middle school level, you start your year off with a master schedule, and changing that is very challenging. And at an elementary school, as Mr. Verdi pointed out, that if you change kids' classrooms after the fact, you really have to be cognizant of the relationships that those kids have established with their teachers, many dynamics. So for the first time ever in my knowledge, we all were at the same table having the conversation about, okay, how do we respond to the needs of our schools, but also balance that out with living within our budget. And one of the things we really want to work with you and present to you is this concept of when we're in summer, it will help us tremendously if you have confirmed enrollment. And by confirmed enrollment, we're thinking we want to see you upwards of 85, 90% if that is possible. And as we looked at it this summer, we had situations where a school was asking, hey, we need allocations in this grade, but then we would look at Infinite Campus and we'd go, yeah, but only 50% are registered. It's hard to make decisions, which we've done in the past. Only when we see whites of their eyes did we make decisions a lot of times. But we really are asking you, and part of your feedback today is how do we improve confirmed enrollment? And so we would need your feedback there. But we really are looking to the best of our knowledge, be able to make decisions in the summer when appropriate, with a certain level of confidence that we are making the right decisions, not only for your school, but as Mike said, that we're not overspending through allocations and being short-sighted on putting ourselves in another budget deficit.
Thank you, Troy.
So we have another trivia question for you, and we often get the question, why do we do 4 counts, and why do we wait to make any decisions until that 4th count? How much fluctuation do you think there is, on average, between the 1st and the 4th count in a typical school year? Any guesses? Troy has the mic.
Or just shout it.
It'll become a required opportunity. Shout it out. Anything? Any guesses? How many kids difference between the 1st count and the 4th count in a typical year? 5 kids? Oh, 5%? 10%? 12%? I got it. You have to convert that to a percent now. We got to do some math now. Whole numbers, not percents. All right, so the numbers in, what is this, the last couple years? Like 500 something, 900 something, 667, 594. So there's a pretty substantial increase from count 1 to count 4 year over year. And again, when we think about whether or not we have any wiggle room in our budget, those are meaningful dollars that really connect to whether we can support the allocations that we've budgeted for.
Thank you, Emily. So once again, this is where we start really getting a lot better numbers. They're official, everybody's counting. I know you guys do a really good job trying to get these Friday counts in. And so we're looking at those. We pull that information like on the Friday. We'll try to, we basically have to rebuild all our allocations and compare it to what you originally were given. And then it's tough to meet on Monday because everybody has to absorb this a little bit. So at least by the next Tuesday, we're trying to meet and really look at that grade by grade, school by school, and say what's going on, what's happening. You get a lot of areas where somebody's about to trigger an allocation or somebody's may lose one. I mean, there's a lot of information to decipher. Area soups really dive into it, and I think they, from what I see, they do a great job of contacting you guys and involving you in that process each step of the way, each week of the way. And a lot of times, once again, we're trying to live within this overall budget because this first count, it's usually far less than the budget. This is about the time when I start freaking out because it's like, hey, this is a lot of money. This is way below what we anticipated. But we've tracked this historically over the years, and we know that from that first count date to the 4th count date, there's a lot of fluctuation. And several years ago, it didn't really stabilize, and we had to pull about $4 million out of the budget. And that's why I'm a little hesitant to say, throw in a bunch of growth in the budget and things like that, because it hasn't been materializing. So anyway, we know there's a lot of fluctuation. We hope from week to week that ends up being more than the budget, but this current year was the first time that's happened in 3 years. And once again, where we do see changes here, you know, it's first week, second week. If we're adding allocations, we're usually going to do a long-term sub because we know at the end there may be some shifting, and it's easier to shift a person into a long-term sub position than do an overage process.
So real quick I want to give an example of an adjustment that we made that avoided student movement. Is we were seeing very low kindergarten numbers at a school, and as you know, For those who are in elementary, the kindergartners don't start right away, and so we hadn't distributed those kids yet. But it was very clear, based on student counts in the early fall, that we were probably not going to justify the number of allocations. So while we didn't avoid an overage per se, we did avoid changing of kindergarten classrooms after school had started. And to my knowledge, again, that was another one of the, hey, we're actually communicating with our principals and across all departments, and we're able to make some decisions earlier so that we don't make every decision on that fourth count day. And we were able to alleviate some of the angst that we create when we get decisions in the fourth week, and we could have made them in the first week. And in this year we had that situation where we were able to not impact students, only the adults were impacted.
I think another big change we made, in the past few years we've got what are called supplemental class size reduction allocations from the state. We don't really know what those are up front. It's usually you apply for it and in December they're going to tell you about it. We don't even know yet, but what we did is anticipate that we would receive some of those. So while we were doing the allocation process, we were able to leverage those allocations and provide for them up front. Because in the past, it'd be after December, we'd get these allocations, and it's really tough to put those in at that point in time. So this allowed you to get allocations that we're not really even sure we're going to get yet. We hope we do, but those are already in your schools helping you out in first and second and third grade.
All right, so real quick, when it does come time to make those final count day decisions, want you to realize that there are many factors that at some times the mathematical formula, we have to look at other factors. Your schools are all very unique, so we take into consideration when it comes to final decisions, it could be, how close are you to needing allocations? What developments do you have in your zone that are going to produce children at your school? We always take into factor student achievement measures. There are times when principals give us feedback that we're good. We actually don't need that allocation, even though by formula it might be triggering. A big factor also is teacher licensure. Sometimes we are not able to overage and have a hard time matching up certain licensing. And then not as much with us building new schools, but in the past we've had real challenges due to school capacity and multi-track and many different factors that create the appearance that we're not even really doing the same math that we show you on your guidelines.
So once the count day allocations are finalized, any allocation changes are obviously communicated to schools and the fall overage placement process starts. We're not going to focus as much on that today because we do have a tentative agreement with the WEA to develop a work group to really evaluate what that overage process looks like and what those contractual guardrails are as it relates to the overage process. I'm sure many of you will be involved in that work, sharing your insight as a building administrator. But we did want to throw out there and get on your radar that there not only are a lot of conversations happening around allocations and what happens during the summer, but we do want to take a look at a process that's been in place for quite some time and work with the association to figure out how we can make it meet the needs of schools and students and staff.
And outside of the normal regular teacher allocations, we do have other allocations for EL, GT, and special ed. Those, once again, are based on formulas, and it depends on how many of those students are here or there. We have a lot of fixed allocations that are dedicated to these areas. So in general, we're living within those, but those will adjust according to the fourth count day enrollment also. And a lot of these adjust during the year, especially for special ed, and we can hand out aides and assistants and additional teachers based on that.
So finally, just to kind of sum up the work that was done during this last summer and to set the stage for the conversations that you'll have during leveled time, our goals really were to utilize the staffing guidelines, which obviously provide some objective criteria around allocations, but then marry that with enrollment data and then all of the other little bubbles that Troy talked about before, which are the feedback that you give from a building level, to figure out, again, how can we make decisions during the summer to decrease the number of overages, minimize student movement, maximize the resources that we have in order to meet student needs, and to stay within budget. And as a part of that continuous improvement process, we're really looking forward to furthering this conversation in level time, getting your feedback, aggregating that, and then continuing that collaborative work between the business office, human resources, school leadership, and then, of course, where appropriate, the employee associations. So thank you for your time today.